got a question about this whole thing, Jesus, with where's God fit in with all of this? Because when you've got so much stuff going on, sometimes like opposing stuff, and then you've got spirits around you as well.
Which complicate things a bit more.
Which complicate it more. How can you hear God? Like, how can you hear God's voice amongst your own issues? And then...
Well, the very first thing that needs to be said about that, Nicky, is when we're insincere, we really don't want to hear God's voice. So that's where the majority of us want to hear what we want to hear. We don't want to hear anything other than something nice about ourselves. Basically, that's fundamentally what we want. So we're not prepared to hear God's voice about almost any matter, for the most part. What we're looking for is our own voice reflected in God. In other words, we're looking for our own opinions, for God to say, yeah, they're mine too. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for agreement from God. Now, of course, that's not a very sincere place, but that is what we're looking for. The reason why we're looking for that is because agreement means that we don't have to change anything. It means we're already fine and we don't have to do anything else. And so the majority of us are looking for that. And in that place, any prayer we have is completely insincere. Because we're basically asking God to just confirm what we already think we know. Now, I find this very interesting because when we travel, Mary and I travel a lot, meet a lot of people, right? And all through the last 2,000 years, this has been the case. When we first meet a person, generally we get conversing and we get to know them a bit, and eventually they start asking some questions about themselves, about, well, how do I do this or how do I do that? What's my state now? Or those kind of questions. And almost without exception, when you start telling them the truth that you know from God about the situation, there's always this very powerful knee-jerk reaction of they didn't want to hear it. It's very interesting. They ask the question, but they're not listening to an answer. Now, what causes a person... You think of a child when it asks the question. A child asks the question and they listen to the answer. So what causes a person to ask a question and not listen to the answer?
An addiction. They want like a confirmation about how they see themselves.
Yes, so they're not asking a question, are they?
They're not. There's no feeling of truth in the question.
Well, they're not even asking a question. The real question they should be asking is, I believe this is what I'm like. Can you agree with me, please? That's really what they're saying. The question is, can you please agree with me? And I notice this a lot in our seminars. People ask questions, but a lot of the times they're just asking for agreement. And really what they should be doing is instead of asking a question, making a statement. I think I'm like this. And I go, fair enough. I don't agree, but you know what I mean? Like, that would be more honest. But interestingly, even in our childhood, we've been taught that if you do believe something about yourself, you're not allowed to just come out and say it, really. Far more polite to ask a question about it than it is to actually come out and make a statement. But if you think about it from a sincerity perspective, a lot of times with our relationship with God, we're making statements to God that we want God to agree with, but we're couching them as questions. And the fact that many of us do that when we're listening to divine truth is proof that many of us are doing that with God. Right? When you're truly asking a question, you are not going to be antagonistic towards the answer. Even if that answer is completely false, you'll be able to hear it and think about it and then work out whether it's false or not. Right? But when you're antagonistic in terms of you have an emotional response to the answer, after you've asked a question, it means you didn't want the answer. You wanted what you believe the answer should be. Right? Now, most of us have that injury. And so when we ask questions as adults, we haven't got an open heart for the answer. We've only got an open heart to have an agreement. And that's the reason why we're asking this question. So these problems are problems that we face with our sincerity. If I'm insincere in this regard, you remember God's laws are like intricate. They, as the Paget message has said in one message, that grinds very finely, the law, God's laws. So when God's law is grinding through our questions, it's going, yeah, that wasn't sincere. Yeah, that wasn't sincere either. That wasn't sincere either. That wasn't sincere. Oh, there's one that was sincere. I can respond to that one. And God will respond instantly to anything that's sincere. And that is the thing to remember, that God is not going to be backward in coming forward with response unless you are insincere. So if the Lord and God is measuring my sincerity, and very frequently I am thinking I'm praying but I'm not receiving responses, then what I'm doing is not praying. Bearing in mind that a prayer is a sincere longing with God. So in the case of truth, it would be a sincere longing from God for his truth. That's what it would be. That would be a prayer for truth. A prayer for love would be a sincere longing for God's love. That would be a prayer for love, right? And if there is no response, that immediately tells us the answer. You weren't sincere. Right? And that's a good thing to know that. I find it interesting, though, that many people who have read the Paget messages, for example, go, oh, but, there are times, maybe we just didn't feel it. Or maybe it just wasn't, maybe God's going to take his time answering that. You hear that a lot, Why would God take his time? He doesn't need to take time for anything. He can answer anything instantly. Why does he need to take time? He doesn't need to take time. Now, he knows you might need time because you might need to sort some things out with your sincerity. But as soon as you are sincere, he will respond. Right? He's not going to delay any response for any other reason than the law measures you as being insincere. So this is the thing you need to bear in mind in your relationship with God, is that unless I am getting a response, then I've got to look strongly at my lack of sincerity. And particularly look at, am I asking things of God that I want a certain answer, and I know what I want. I want the answer to be yes on that one or no on that one. Do you know what I mean? Or I've already determined in my own mind what I want the answer to be. Is that how it is? Because if that is how it is, then you're not going to get very many answers, except where your question is in agreement with God's. Yeah. Thanks. Rolf?
Could it be that I ask a question to God where I am sincere, but still not able to feel an answer?
No, this is the thing about sincerity, Rolf. When you're sincere, it automatically opens you to your feelings. In fact, you can't be sincere without your feelings being involved. So the answer to that question is actually no. If you're not receiving a response, it's not because you're not sensitive enough. It's because your question was not sincere. Because if it was sincere, your emotions would have been involved, and therefore you would have been sensitive enough to receive a response. Yeah. And you can see this a lot with the expression of love if you think about it. When a person's quite insincere in their expression of love, they might say the words "I love you" or whatever, but their actions are completely devoid of any feelings that motivate them to demonstrate that love to you in one way or the other. Make sense? True sincerity opens your heart to the response. That's why the law requires sincerity. God knows that it's pointless giving you a response if you're not sincere, because your heart's not open to the response. The reason why the law is working like it works is when you are sincere, your heart becomes open to receiving. Make sense? Now, when God gives you the response, you are now able to feel and receive that response. But when you're insincere, your heart is closed. So if God tried to respond, what would happen? It would be like bouncing off a brick wall. Nothing would enter you anyway. There's no point in responding to the insincerity because nothing's going to enter. You follow? So when it comes to your relationship with God, the reason why the law requires sincerity is because sincerity is what opens your heart to receive. If the law just said, no, sincerity is not required, then when you asked for something and your heart was closed, you imagine God would be sharing with all these people whose hearts are closed, and all this energy would be going out, but it would be going nowhere. So that's not how God works with his soul. And by the way, he recommends you don't work that way with yours either. It's interesting. And this is an interesting fact about love, just natural love. God recommends that you share your love with the people who are open to receiving it. Makes sense? Yeah. Because if you share it with the people who are not open to receiving it, then they're probably not going to receive it. Yeah. Now, of course, a lot of times there is openness in an individual in a moment that then closes in another moment. Isn't it? Like, sometimes that happens too, doesn't it? Where a person has an emotional thing going on, they start to feel some things, all of a sudden they're sincere, they might ask a question, and you start sharing, and initially they're receiving it because their heart is now open, but then I've sometimes noticed people just, the more they're getting, the harder it's getting to receive it, and their sincerity starts closing down again. And then by the time that's closed, you've got to stop. Because nothing's going to go in now, right? So I often feel it's sort of like an empty bottle of water, an empty bottle. And let's say the response is the water. Now, of course, if the lid's on, it's going to go everywhere but in the bottle, isn't it? Yeah. And if our soul is the bottle, it requires the lid to be off. And sincerity is what gets the lid off.